Ok. Bueno, Diego, entonces vas a ver conmigo los videos de Nueva Zelanda otra vez, aunque ya te los viste. O Juanita, quien me vaya a revisar esto. No sé si son grave como todos 1000 horas, las 1000 horas que veré todos los días. Espero que sí. Listo, entonces solo voy a mostrar una cosita y es, a ver, esto no es talleres, que ya vi el primero y lo pasé. Entonces voy a ver el resto, pero no lo voy a copiar tan bonito, porque quiero terminar de verlos todos y luego me los vuelvo a ver y los paso así como pasé este. Este fue el primero, esto es lo que copié, Perdón si hay errores. Pero voy a ver entonces los otros. No mames, la memoria está bajando. Ah. Ah.
I am on my balcony again. It is very nice. I'm drinking some tea. The birds are obscenely loud. It's very nice.
Bueno, él no está esperando, así que yo también estoy esperando, pero voy a anotar en el lugar lo que más pueda del taller. Pero viéndolo de corrido es muy difícil, la verdad, el anterior lo paré como 20 veces.
We will be starting up in 2 more minutes.
Vale. Y viéndolo así, pues solo, o sea, voy a captar lo que más pueda de lo que ya. Pero es que quiero ver los
Is
temas.
everyone having a fun isolation?
Okay.
Is everyone coming to club night after this? It'll be lit. Go to the Auckland page. Exec members watching. Drop a link. We'll be starting at 5 o'clock as usual, so 1 more minute. We live in a little compound area, so I can see all of the different apartments, and it's definitely the type of setting where you could have an Italian singing video. 1 more minute. Beautiful. We can start. Hello. Welcome to another session of our development seminars. Today we are discussing... So initially the way this was advertised is it's going to be a session about rebuttal, but I actually think that limits it too much. If you tuned into the last session, you would have heard that we had a lot of chat about why rebuttal points are slightly limited, or that the things that people try and achieve with rebuttal points are often actually achieved with other points. So the broader discussion we're actually going to be having today is talking about responsiveness. Basically, how do you take your case and make sure it is pointed in a way that is useful against other people's cases? How do you fill the gaps left by their cases? How do you identify the things that go wrong in their points so that you can effectively respond to them? Before we dive into all of that stuff, I'm going to do two things. Firstly, I'm going to explain to you some of the excellent events that are coming up that you should all be going to. And then secondly, I'm just going to situate this in some of the discussions we had been having in the earlier development seminars. So in terms of the stuff that is coming up, firstly, after this is Club Night. Club Night is awesome, especially if you want an opportunity to practice some of the things that we have been talking about. So in the comment section, there is a little link that says all of the information for signing up. That's tonight. Very low key, very chill. All you need to do is, don't even need to find a friend actually, just if you have some friends, bring them along. If you don't, we'll put you in teams, have a debate, will be very fun. The second thing I want to talk to you about is Cinnamon Scroll. So Cinnamon Scroll is a tournament that is coming up in just over a week. Very similar process, just flick a message to the Auckland exec or flick a message into our Google form. We will find you a team if you don't have a team, but if you do need a team, if you do have a team, we'd love to have you, so we'd love to have you join. So that's everything that is coming up over the next little bit. We do have some other stuff like our Women's Development Day, we have our Novice Tournament, range of different things. Go to our Facebook page and that'll cover all of those things. So in terms of situating responsiveness and rebuttal within the broader area of things that we are talking about, I'm going to remind people what we discussed in the previous session. So in the first session, we talked about prep time, and essentially what, in my opinion, the two things you need to figure out to have an effective case. The first thing is the comparative, figuring out what the two things you are comparing, and then the second thing is the framework. Figuring out how the judge should be judging this debate in order, and giving them the framework so that they can make that decision with guidance from you rather than just leaving it all up to the adjudicator. Once you figure out those two things, your comparative, the two things that are being compared, and your framework, what are your priorities, what are the things you care about, it becomes much easier to generate a case. And these two concepts will be used through almost every single video because they're quite key to the idea of what debating is. The second episode that we had was talking about different speaker positions. So we discussed the ways in which different speakers have slightly different roles in teams, both in terms of the rules that bind them and in how they approach things. So because this is a responsive section, this is mainly pointed towards speakers who are later within the debate, but note, when you are setting up your speeches, if you look out for these things just as much as people who are responding to, you'll be much more able to have a speech that lasts within the debate because you've been thinking about the ways that other teams can respond to them, and you've done some preemptive work to try and bolster up your material. Last session, we talked about the different you can run. So essentially those are the most common, your substantive and your rebuttal points, which most of you all learned if you did schools debating. And obviously this session is going to be incredibly helpful to talking about the rebuttal points because you go through the different things that are wrong. But we also talked about clash points, which I think is the purest form of having a responsive speech is when you get to the clash points, because they're about two teams, each offering different versions of the world and aggressively trying to push their version over the line. So what we discussed today is all the different ways you can bring down the opposition's world in order to make yours more relevant. So that's how we've discussed, that's material that we discussed in the previous sessions. And so I think we can dive straight in to what we're going to be discussing today. And I would once again note that if you have any questions or have any comments, please flick them below. I can see the comments as they come up, and we'll be able to respond in real time. We've also got an anonymous question form, so if you have some anonymous questions, feel free to flick a message. I'll just get that form up for me right now. Flick a message to that anonymous form, and then I'll be able to then see it pop up next to me, and I'll be able to answer it if you aren't comfortable with having your comment put out there, or you just want to write something a little bit more in-depth that you then want me to read. So I'll just grab that form up right now. Boop-a-doop-a-doop. It's going to be very good. Development session 4. Open it up. Do you have any questions yet? No. That probably to be explained. Okay, so what is responsiveness? Responsiveness is trying to take your vision of what the world is and contrast it with what the opposition's world is in order to make your side the most believable and therefore persuade the judge that they should agree with the things that you were telling them, which will likely fit into the framework you've set up. So you'll set up those priorities, you'll put particular points towards achieving those priorities or win conditions, and then your opposition will try and attack them. The opposition will offer different types of words. So responsiveness is creating engagement between those two worlds, trying to figure out how to take down the other world. I think this is very useful for when we think about what training is in general. And so what I want to do at the beginning of this is just explain how some of the ideas that we talk about now, and in fact a lot of the ideas that we talk about through these Thursday live streams, can be actually put into your own debating. Training is actually learning how to do things really, really quickly, to the point where you can learn things how to do things intuitively. So often when I'm training within debating, the speeches that I'll give will be slightly different to the speeches I'll give in an actual tournament, because training is a little bit artificial. It's about making sure that you do all of the little things so that hopefully when you get to a moment in a tournament, you can just do those things intuitively. You can just like let yourself be taken over by them and flow with them. So all of the things that I tell you in this session, because I go through very in-depth how points can be flawed, if I'm in training, I'll hold myself to making sure I tick all of those boxes, even if some are less effective than others, in order to make sure I'm making those types of critiques intuitive in the way I debate, implicit in the way I debate. And so that then, when I get into an actual tournament environment, it's much more natural for me to chop and change between them, mix them up as the efficiency of the speech dictates. And so training can be a little bit artificial, but that artificiality then lends itself to being useful when you actually go to do debating. When you are looking at the difference between rebuttal and substantive, note that it isn't just about getting rid of it's not just about knocking down the opposition's world, saying they're wrong for all of these reasons. I think the line between rebuttal and substantive, when we talk about the difference between rebuttal and substantive, it's potentially a little bit overstated. Because what we're talking about when we are talking about responsiveness, it's not just about knocking down someone's world, it's also about building your world up. You're always having a comparison there. So I want you guys to make a change in your approach to thinking about responsiveness, in that it's not just about getting out 6 different responses to a point that the opposition has brought. Rather, it's about very diligently comparing the two worlds that you want to offer in order to make sure yours comes on top. You need to be filling the gap that is left by each of the points. That's why when I set up a responsive point, what I'm going to do in this seminar is go through all the ways it can be flawed, but at the end of that, I always make sure I tell the adjudicator what the answer is. So if something isn't true about the opposition's case, what is the truth? What is the gap? What is the argument that I put into that gap? Because it's way more believable for an adjudicator when you tell someone that the opposition's world doesn't make sense, if you're able to give them a vision of what world does make sense, so that the opposition can't just be like, no, they just asserted that's not true, they weren't able to tell us what was true, therefore our point stands. It's they have a really solid thing that they can push against, and the adjudicator is much more clear in going through that. What I'm going to do for the rest of the session, the next 50-ish minutes of the session, is I'm literally just going to go through every single way in which a point can be flawed. I recommend you, if you are taking notes, write down each of these particular things and then put them into a framework that you can use within training, like a little checkbox, being like, have I thought about, for example, was the point responsive to stuff we previously said? Have I thought about how the logic applies itself? Have I thought about how it fits into our framework? And just as I was explaining earlier with the point of training being to start getting yourself to do the stuff intuitively, if you hold yourself to that standard, have that little checkbox, which you won't actually do in most competitive debates because things are moving too quickly, you need to be efficient, you need to be able to move forward, it is quite useful for figuring out, well, am I being thorough enough? Do I have all of the foundations, all of the possible ways I can respond? And set it up like that. Okay. So I like to split the way I respond to points into broadly 2 different frameworks, 2 different types of attacks, and then there's like a little third one that isn't technically responding to their point, but is a way you can make your responses more impactful, the way you can make your responses stick within the debate. So the way I split the way I think about rebuttal points, one is a rebuttal point particularly focused to how the point the opposition has made fits into the rest of the debate. And so that means that I'm not just looking at the point in isolation, how the logic of the point operates, the context of the point, its application, its impact in the framework. You're actually looking at how the point operates in interaction with the rest of the points within the debate. And I think there's three ways that speakers can often set up points within the context of a particular debate that makes, even though the point may seem smart in isolation, actually make it less effective. These two things are, the point could be unresponsive to stuff that you have previously bought. It can be uncomparative, so it's missed the target of what people are trying to achieve in the debate, the things that you're arguing between, or it can be contradictory. So let's just go through those three things. It can be unresponsive in that it doesn't attempt to address one of the points you have made. It's just an assertion chucked out into the ether. It's just thrown out into the debate. It is very effective if you are, and very efficient within a debate, if you're able to point out how your material you already have takes down points that they have made. So for example, you have a great substantive point at your first speaker. Their first speaker stands up, tries to rebut your point, but misses a whole bunch of it, then claims a bunch of things that were contradicted by the stuff that you had previously bought. If you're a second speaker, you can stand up and be like, this point would be great if we hadn't already told you how this thing works, this thing works, this thing works, therefore the broader rebuttal point that they're making isn't effective. It just means you're able to take your rebuttal material and make it very efficiently, because you're leaning on the material that has already been brought within the debate, and if they haven't dealt with it explicitly, it's easy for the judge to think, oh, that was a bit of a waste of speech, I'm going to have to see what their later speakers do. So, pointing out whether material is unresponsive is useful. The second thing is it's uncomparative. And essentially the way I like to think of uncomparativeness is that it's missing the target of the debate. It's just like, it might be entirely true, it might be entirely right, but it is not the two things you're comparing in the debate. And that can go in one of two directions. Either they can mischaracterize what you're standing for, they can claim that some awful impact will flow from the model that you set up, that you didn't actually set up and is contradictory to what you actually stand for. And a very easy way to deal with it was be like, yes, it would be entirely true that that thing would happen if that was the model we set up, but that's not the comparison within the debate. The comparison is between these two things, therefore none of that material stands. Very easy way to outflank it in the debate. The second way to respond to things is stuff that's uncomparative from their end. So they haven't mischaracterized you, but they've tried to set up in the debate, most usually in a way that is non-mutually exclusive. For example, they set it up that they'd like education to be the solution, and there's nothing in the motion that says that both teams can't stand for education. A very easy way to respond to that point is to claim, well, that's uncomparative. We can also stand for education, therefore that's not a unique benefit on your side of the house. So either because they're misrepresenting your point, or they're trying to claim something that isn't mutually exclusive, those are things within the context of the debate that can very easily allow you to knock that point out. The final thing is just when a point is contradictory with material that has previously been brought. And because debating is an activity where lots of different things can be true, and in fact lots of contradictory things are true, right? Oftentimes, if you have any debate, one team will win on one side and win on material that the judge thought was good, but in another room, the other team will win on the entirely opposite material, so entirely contradictory. So often contradictions happen, and you can't get away from it. Often teams will run material that is contradictory within itself. The way that you use contradict, like the claim that the idea that an opposition's material is contradictory in a debate, is not to knock out both bits of material unless you're very lucky, unless it shows some deep underlying flaw within the way that they're debating, which means neither of the things that are claiming can be true. Most of the times, it's about stopping the opposition from having their cake and eating it too, because they'll want to claim that the world is one way in order to make one point work, and then they'll want to say, well, the world is the opposite in another point in order to make that other point. And often younger teams will do this because they aren't thinking about the broader line of their case, they're not assessing their points to make sure they're consistent, and so they'll try and claim two things at the same time. Essentially what you do with a claim that the opposition's point is contradictory is force them to choose one way or the other. And normally you actually tell them which way it goes to knock out their stronger point and try and bring up that material, but it stops them from being able to claim two things. So if, for example, they run a contradictory material, the way you respond to it and actually saying the words is you stand up and be like, this is the assumption that point A rests on, this is the assumption that point B rests on, these are contradictory, which means that only one of these things can be true. At that point, the judge and the opposition team are thinking like, fuck, which of these points are we going to choose? How are we going to explain that they can be reconciled? But you've essentially taken their two benefits and divided it into one benefit. So already very effective, very efficient. Then what you do, because they haven't wanted to choose one side or the other, you're the much more reasonable, plausible team, and that you can challenge them and say, this is how the world actually looks. That means this point is gone. This next point is now the only point that they have. Here's how we defeat the point for other reasons. So you can then, if an opposition has run contradictory material, accept the assumption that takes out their weaker point and explain why you think that assumption, explain why the assumption for the weaker point is far more plausible, therefore they can't run the stronger point, and then attack for other reasons that weaker point in order to knock it out. So you have a little bit of strategy there in being able to choose between the two different versions. The last thing that I'll say is that, the last type of those in-debate responsive things is a framework response. And this also affects the way that the point actually operates. I'll talk about it a little bit more later. But sometimes a team that will run a point that seems very correct, but it won't fit within the framework that that both teams have set up. So for example, if both teams agree that children are the most important thing in a debate about the rights of children, which, most of the time teams will do, the way in which you use a framework attack is if they make claims, or if they try and make points that are outside of that framework that both teams agree on, you can minimize the importance of those points quite dramatically, even if those points are true. So often, if you want to be particularly lazy, you can say like, okay, we accept that it may be really shitty for parents if XYZ thing happens, but both teams have accepted from the framework of the debate that children's rights are most important, therefore we don't think it is that important. So those are the 4 ways: unresponsiveness, uncomparativeness, contradictory material, or just like unimportant stuff that doesn't fit the agreed on framework of the debate. Those are the in-debate types of responsiveness that are very useful to use. So we've had an anonymous question. As a first speaker, is it worthwhile to try to implement some pre-rebuttal or responses to claims you think the other teams are going to make in the debate? So I think this is a very, very good question, and it's particularly useful in terms of all of the different rebuttal questions that we're going through. So the unresponsive, uncomparative, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. When you are setting up your case, you need to make sure that you are thinking about all of those other things. And this is once again where the comparative nature of debating, what I talked about earlier, comes in. If you are going to claim that one version of the world is true, you need to make sure that the assertions that you rely on are clear, the context is clear, the logic is clear, all of those points that we're dealing with, so you can go through in your head like that. But then you also start thinking about how the other team is going to be pointing their case. So you start bolstering up the bits of your speech. So for example, you think there's going to be a lot of clash over the assertion underlying a point, so you're going to put a lot of material and time into making sure that it's really well fleshed out. That's where you're going to put a lot more of your time. So to be very specific to the question, when we question something like pre-rebuttal, it's generally not actually like pre-rebuttal. It's not like standing up before I get into my 3 points, I want to say one thing because I know they're going to run points. Sometimes it will be very clear that the other team will run this one thing, but it's very small, so you can have like a little rebuttal section. But most of the time, your pre-rebuttal will be integrated into the rest of the speech that you are making. So thinking about the ways you can bolster the claims that you make within your speech relative to the claims that you think are likely to be made by the opposition, that's how you set up your pre-rebuttal within your speech. Make sure you're going through it when you're actually setting up those points. So thank you, that was a very, very good question.
Hi, Daniel.
Hey, Sammy.
Hi.
My flatmate is saying hi to me. Okay, so the second type of rebuttal points that I spoke about at the beginning of this are responses that attack the point itself. So not necessarily trying to make a claim about the point relative to the rest of the debate, but just being like, hey, this point doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for one of like many different reasons. And so I think there are broadly 6 ways in which a point can be flawed in terms of the point that the point themselves. And what you'll notice is the ways that I think a point can be flawed match up very neatly with the ways in which I think people should be setting up their points. Because if people are making sure they're setting up their points to avoid these flaws or to basically build their case in a way that's effective, it makes it much harder for the opposition to pick it apart simply from you forgetting to do stuff. Because remember, any of the things that I'm going to talk about now are most effective when the opposition has just failed to do it, right? Because that means you just have this blank space you can pour your world into that wrecks their world. And to guard against that, in relation to the anonymous question that we earlier got, you need to start filling in those gaps within your case in order to make sure that they don't just have that like free run towards the goal, whatever sports metaphor we can use there. Okay, so the 6 ways that points can be flawed. The first is assertions. So assertions are essentially the underlying ideas to how your broader how the broader debate works. Sorry, how the broader points works. So say, for example, we're having a debate about whether or not we should make drugs illegal, and one of the points that the team against legalizing drugs stands up and says is, well, drugs kill people, making it illegal would mean that less people are able to access drugs, which means that less people will die from things like drug overdoses. The assertion in that case would be the idea that drugs are harmful for you, or that are always harmful for you. And it might be true, and so the assertion will be true to some degree, but then you are like, okay, well, how true is it? So is it like totally out of the world? Does it knock down their whole point? Does it knock down some of their point? But figuring out what the underlying assertions within the case, and they're often unstated, means that you can throw off all that analysis. And there is almost no feeling better in the world when someone has had like one assertion about the underlying point of the debate, and then they've built this incredibly big mechanism on it that's like really smart and really well walked through and really engaging, and that you are just like, well, that all seems to be true, except if you consider why the underlying assertion, drugs are bad, isn't necessarily true. So they can prove that less people can have drugs, they can go into all the different analysis about like drug supply lines, but if they're unable to prove that single underlying assertion, then they're unable to win the debate. So first step first, see if there's any underlying reasoning to the point that if you pull it out like a bottom Jenga tile, their whole case can collapse. That's the assertions. The second way in which a point can be flawed is if the context of the point is flawed. This is very similar to figuring out whether their assertions are wrong, but it's not about something that they're relying on, that they've either stated or is implicit within their case. It's something equally foundational and underlying that they failed to talk about. So if the assertion, or attacking their assertions, is attacking something that they've added to their case that is wrong, the context attack will be about, hey, they've missed something and how they set up their assertions, which changes the way the whole point operates. So often when you are, and this is quite hard to guard against, because it's very hard to figure out what you haven't included within your points, and so, like, do your best if you're a first speaker to make sure that you've covered all of the different things that could come up in terms of the context of the points, in terms of the underlying assertions, but sometimes we won't be able to. So the opposition can stand up and be like, oh, they've forgotten this really important bit of context that changes the way all these mechanisms operate, and then your second and third speakers will need to come in and either explain why that extra bit of context isn't true, or explain why that extra bit of context doesn't have the impact that is claimed by the opposition. So that is when you will need to come in and fix it as a later speaker, and that's about when there's something missing from the case, some like missing factor, for example, in a Southeast Asia debate, whether like none of the teams have talked about China, for example, and China has a huge impact on how the mechanisms operate. So that's the opportunity where you can point out that something's missing from the context, you need to add it there. The third thing that needs to be addressed is the logic of the point. This is probably one that is quite hard to teach, because essentially it's about going through just bit by bit each step and figuring out whether or not each logical step leads to the other logical step. So for example, if we go to the example of the debate about legalizing drugs, and the team that is anti-legalizing drugs thinks that making drugs, well, keeping drugs legal diverts supply chains. They'll make that claim with several logical links. Not the assertions, because like this is accepting that drugs are already bad and that we want to decrease their overall accessibility. This is in their mechanism. So they'll be like, we think that people like listening to the government because they like morality and they get a lot of their guidance from the state. We think that individuals are really afraid of being punished, so there's a deterrent effect. We think that if we lock people up there's less likely to be more drug dealers in society because the people who deal drugs won't be able to deal drugs from prison. So they'll be layering on these bits of analysis in order to lead them to the conclusion that less people will consume drugs. So essentially what you're doing with a logic attack or responding to the logic of the point is explaining why the particular points don't add up in the way that is effective. So either explaining why each of the points isn't true, or going into the very specifics and explaining why actually we think this thing will happen instead of this thing will happen. It's about explaining how the logic of the point flows in one way or in another way. The fourth thing that I want to talk about is the application of those points. And essentially what that's about is about that end jump to the conclusion. Because they might have said each little thing that is true, they might have said lots of things that are true in that lead up. So say, for example, it is true that some people have a deterrent effect. It is true that for some individuals, the government's morality may help you to make particular decisions, and therefore you'll be guided one way or the other. When you're talking about the application of the point, it's about that last link then to the conclusion. So less people will consume that drug. And what you need to do there is to walk through why, in particular, it's either a very, very small harm, it is not a harm that is particularly relevant in the debate. Try and figure out how, because often teams will be a little bit manipulative in how they set up their point. So they'll make a bunch of claims, and then they'll try and conclude something enormous from it. And so what you need to do in terms of your application is just figure out, okay, does the logic of the point that they've set up, which yes is clear, there's no missing links, does it lead to the conclusion that they want, or does it lead to a different conclusion? Because what is very effective within debating is if you're able to accept a lot of what the opposition has said is true. You're being very reasonable. It's not just an all-out brawl where you're denying every single thing they say. You just tweak the end result so that the conclusion goes in a different direction. Actually, we think that this is conclusion. If you accept that people are afraid of the state, people are deterrents, the conclusion you get is not people take less drugs. The conclusion that you get is people just take drugs in secret. There's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of shame. So if you see there, if the previous thing that we talked about, the logic point, it's about taking out one of those gaps, so it means that the point can't flow through to the conclusion. The application response is about taking that chain of logic and then tweaking it towards a different conclusion. So that's how you figure out the difference between that logic response and that application response. The fifth thing that we can talk about is the impact of points. And I think this is almost the mirror image of how weighting works in the opposite direction. If you're trying to make your point seem very important, you're going to do similar things, but in exactly the opposite way. And I have like a list of things that I try and do when I'm wanting to ensure that my point has impact within the debate. I'll talk about how severe the point is. So how big is the effect that the point is going to have on the people who feel it? Sometimes the effect can be very mild, sometimes it can be very severe. You are going to be trying to push it in one way or the other. Then you talk about how widespread it is. So if the amount that people affected is very high, you can still win a point by claiming that it's a very small number of people who are affected. So you want to shrink the amount of people and then be like, even though we get a milder benefit, but applied to a much greater group of people, we still win the debate, because that's how you should make the trade-off between the couple of people who are very badly affected and the lots of people who are affected, not that much, but a large amount of them. Therefore, that's something you should care about more. So you can talk about how severe it is, you can talk about how widespread it is. The third thing that I think is important is talking about the particular people who are affected. And this is often, teams will talk about this in terms of wanting to assess the vulnerability of parties. So if it's affecting particularly vulnerable people, even if the effect is small, the people in a particular position where the overall impact it has on their life is very big. These are the types of questions that you want to be asking in relation not just to how severe the effect is, not just to how many people it affects, but also the particular people it is affecting, whether we have a duty to certain people, all of the ways in which the actual quality of the people who we're talking about changes the way that point operates. So that tends to be how I'll set up an impact point. And luckily, sometimes you can be like, everything they said is true, but it's just a tiny impact. Here's the other thing we brought in the debate. Here's why it's most important. And when you are going through your actual points and weighting things as bigger or smaller, the first step of that weighting process is this impact thing I was talking about. And often at the end of my points, especially if it's a clash point, I'll talk about these last two types of responses. I'll talk about the impact, how severe, how broad, which particular people are affected, as the first part of that last bit of my points. The second bit of that, well, basically the proper last thing within those points is then talking about the framework again. So that's figuring out how the impact that they've proven fits within to the overall context of the debate. So say, for example, you have a debate that has sometimes it's judged like, and often debates will be judged utilitarianly. Do we get more benefit on one side or the other? But not always, and we shouldn't just accept that as being the rule. For example, in a debate about whether or not we should kill people and take their organs because it saves more lives to kill one person, like, it's not 100% clear that we should just engage in the option that leads to the most like basic utilitarian outcome of people having more organs, because we might care about things like autonomy, we might care about things like individualism, we might care about the community value, even if like particular individuals would be affected. So the last bit of your point needs to be explaining why, okay, if we accept everything as being proven, or as we have gone through the point, minimizing it or weakening it in certain ways, how then does it fit within the framework of the debate? Once again, always linking back to the idea that you've set up a framework during your prep time as to how the judge should judge the debate, and then the last step of every point, every responsive point, is jumping in and trying to link that into the broader case that you've driven. Okay, if anyone has any questions, just flick down a comment or send a message to the Google form, because I'm sure you have lots of questions about an enormous amount of material that I'm dumping on you. The last thing that we're going to talk about, the last bit before chatting about some general questions, is the third and probably most minor, because it's quite a sneaky rhetorical thing that very good speakers do, way to respond to points, and that's about taking individual responses. So say, for example, you've brought a really good context response, or you've been able to show how one bit of logic doesn't flow, or you've been able to show that their points are impacted quite poorly. It's about using this bit of rebuttal that you think has been very effective and using it to attack the rest of their case. And essentially, the way I like to think about it is often, like, debating at its core is two teams asserting a whole bunch of different things, right? They're just shooting off in lots of different directions. Lots of them are claiming things that no one can ever figure out whether those things are true or not. So the judge can't just be like, X things are true, therefore, end result, therefore, this is how I decide the debate. The judge has to trust each individual team and trust the claims that they're making. This is what it means to be persuasive. And so often, when a judge is faced with two assertions, they'll go with either the team that is more reasonable or the team that is more rhetorical and able to prove those points in a more convincing way. And one of the things that helps you boost up your team's believability, boost up your team's like value within the debate in terms of being believed, in terms of being credible, is to use the rebuttal that you have against particular points of opposition as essentially evidence that they are uncredible, that their claims shouldn't be believed because they have made claims that haven't stood up within the rest of the debate. Because note, if a team is caught lying, or if it's shown as lying, it's way harder for the judge to believe the other claims that they're making that could equally be 50-50 than a team that has held itself to quite like a strict standard of making claims that they can only like prove within the debate, and that makes your team seem broadly more believable. And I have a few things that I like to point out about other teams if I've had like a really effective bit of response. The first, I think, is very easy. It's taking that bit of rebuttal that you've done and branching out to different points that they've made. So saying like, they've misunderstood the context in this point, that's important for all of the other points they're making. I'm going to be really efficient. I'm going to take that one bit and just apply it like laterally, and often that's a good introduction. If you have one bit of rebuttal that affects a lot of their points, they've totally underestimated the role of China in Southeast Asia, this affects everything, here's why, that's a really effective way to use a flaw that you've identified within their case to decrease their overall case competence, because the judge is going to be like, yeah, it does seem a bit weird that they entirely forgot about how China operates, therefore I'm going to have a lot of difficulty believing the other claims that they make within the debate. Other two things that I like to do is either to claim that the opposition is naive. So if you're able to, for example, bring way more sophisticated explanations of how people work, of how situations work, often you'll be able to use that bit of rebuttal that you have as evidence that the opposition's case is constructed in a way that isn't believable, that's naive, that's overly trusting or overly innocent. And as soon as you're able to tar their overall case with that particular characterization, now the judge, every single time they make a claim, is asking, are they being naive? Are they over-leveraging what the actual importance of these points are? How do I trust them there? So you can do that. That's naivety. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I like to accuse other teams of being manipulative. And often when a team, and this is particularly true when teams have been very consistent in drawing a wrong conclusion. So you're attacking the application. They'll say this thing, this thing, this thing, and this thing, but then they'll try and drag the point one way or the other when it's just clearly not working within the debate. if you're able to say, for example, the opposition thinks that if they repeat the same line a dozen times, they will literally trick you into believing that they've responded to the way that we have pushed the world. If you're able to then convince the judge that there's something bad faith about how the opposition is operating and constructing their points, it becomes way harder for that opposition to basically make the judge believe the claims that they're making within a debate. And so if you do that, it helps you get on the rhetorical front foot, it helps you pull attention towards your ideas, helps you push your ideas and the credibility of your ideas far further, because it characterizes the overall opposition's case. And I think this is one of the nice things that separates, well, I don't know if it's nice, but it's one of the things that separates debating from other activities. It's a lot about credibility, it's a lot about like the art behind it, being persuasive, convincing people to come to your side. And so if you're able to leverage your points from one way or the other, and then leverage it towards attacking the overall case or to making the judge believe certain things about the team that you're facing, that can be in a very efficient way to push forward those points and operate with those points. Okay, so that's all of the prepared stuff I had for today. It was a very long chat. Feel free to flick a question in. I'm sure they will be streaming in as we speak. Even if you have particular points where you're like, I'm not sure how I'd respond to this. How would Daniel think about this point? Flick a message. I'm going to have a drink of tea. And I look forward to hearing you. Just have a look at the anonymous questions. Okay, we've got another... Okay, if you can't see anything wrong with their point on face value, but don't want to not respond to it at all, what's the best thing to look for, to pick at? And this will be tough. Sometimes you'll just be losing a debate. And it's really rough to be losing a debate because the other team will be so convincing, their logic will seem impenetrable, the application of their points will seem very good, and you won't know particularly how to respond. So if a team, so I think mainly keep to the ideas that we've been talking about, so make sure you're being very thorough, because most of the time, even if a point is very strong overall, there will be weaknesses within that point, so even if you think the point is likely true, they might have undercooked, like, for example, the context, they might have undercooked the logic, they might have undercooked the application, and that's how you can take a point that is actually good and convince the judge that not enough has been done to actually convince them of that. And I think this is a nice... actually an interesting area to talk about how other countries and other international styles of debating work. So for example, I have lost so many debates to Australians when they stand up and they pick up one little thing missing within your point. Either you didn't focus enough on the context, you didn't focus enough on the logic, they didn't focus enough on the application of your points, and even though your point is true, even though in New Zealand a judge would believe you, because they can make the judge think that you haven't done enough on that particular... Often it's contextual stuff. They'll be like, they haven't thought about this, or they haven't proved how things are marginally impactful. So they love to say, and this is particularly where we get into that stuff about like the importance and the impact. They'll say like, it is true that all those things follow, but they haven't shown you why it'll be worse than the ordinary racism people feel. Or racism will always exist, so it'll always go one with the other. Like, if you are able to pick up on those areas where it's not like the point is wrong, they just haven't done something, that's particularly effective. And note, they could have done the thing. Sometimes you'll just get lucky and the judge wouldn't have been listening that hard and you'll be able to convince the judge that there was that missing gap and that therefore the entire point will fall apart. So Australians often focus on the context, so they often focus on, is something marginal, they try and weigh it out of the debate. Europeans, on the other hand, will be very, very particular about the logic of points. So they'll be like, you said this thing, this thing, this thing, and this thing, but you missed this little logical gap, therefore we can't credit you for the whole point. And I think in New Zealand, we're a little, as judges, we're way more forgiving as to how like the logic of a point needs to flow, because if we understand the overall direction, we think you've done like a good enough job showing me leap to leap, we're willing to be a little bit more credulous, like believe the teams a little bit more that the claims they're making are strong, and that it's not enough just to point out that one link is missing, you have to explain actually how it would go in a different direction. So, if you are unsure how to respond to a point, look for the gaps in the logic, and even if you think they can fill in that gap, that's an extra thing that their third speaker or their second speaker has to do, and if their third speaker or second speaker isn't able to pick that up, you may be able to sneak away from the point. This is one of the reasons why I think debating overseas is actually quite helpful, because even though different circuits have different focuses, and stuff that I do if I was debating in Europe might be slightly different to stuff that I would do, say, if I was debating in New Zealand, it's still useful for your debating overall. Because debating against Australians has made me really, really careful to make sure that I've got my context set out nicely, that I'm explaining why points are marginal, that I'm walking through the impacts. And my time debating against Europeans has made me really careful to walk through each of my points in terms of the logic of it, make sure that there are no little chinks in the armor or gaps in the armor that the opposition will be able to exploit. And even though it's not that useful in New Zealand, it's still to some degree useful in New Zealand, and then going forward to convince other judges. So it does make you into a more well-rounded speaker, and I think that is very useful for you as a whole. So thank you, that was a very good question. We'll have some more tea. Flick us a message, friends. Rebuttal. Can everyone else hear the music that's playing really loudly from one of the flats around me? Not really sure which direction that's coming from. Doop-a-doop. I just get to relax for the rest of the live session. You know you have a burning question. I have some more hot water. That was very clever. What has been your proudest debating moment? Oh, that's cute. I coached an inter-res team, inter-residential debating in Auckland, 2 people who hadn't done a huge amount of debating before, and they won an inter-res, so I was extremely, extremely proud in that moment. I was very happy when I won the Throppy. That was cute. I'm old now. I have lots of proud moments, which is nice. Yeah, but also just like proud moments in debating in general isn't just like your debating achievements. It's also like, I'm very proud of the friendships I have. I'm proud of the fact that my flatmates are all debaters, and it has given me a support network of lovely people who I can talk to during a quarantine. I'm very proud of the fact that the community came together and is having fun chats about debating, even though we're all locked in our particular rooms. And we still get to organize online tournaments, and we still have like Discord chats and have live streams where your friends call in. It's pretty beautiful. Let's see if any more fun facts have come in. Oh, fuck, lots of others. Everyone was just writing their questions. Okay, could you discuss how to layer responses well when pointing out those flaws in a point, even ifs, etc.? Okay, yeah, neat. So often I'll layer responses in a very similar way to the way that I went through them today. So I'll explain that why something was unresponsive, then whether it was uncomparative, then it was contradictory, how it fits into the framework, the assertion, context, logic, application. So sometimes I'll just go through very thoroughly, and that's if I just want to like obliterate a point. Sometimes you don't need to layer responses. Sometimes one response is enough. You just dive right in, get it done efficiently, and then you're able to go away laughing. What I think separates beginner and then intermediate and advanced level of debating in terms of how they layer stuff is not necessarily how they layer the actual bits of response that they're bringing. So it's not that fact that they talk about the assertion and the context and the logic. It's more how they gather up the points that have come from the opposition. And dear God, if you debate against people from Sydney, maybe it's changed a little bit now, but in the past, they used to stand up and be like, I have 15 subpoints. And then they'd give you like 15 mechanisms that were all just like slightly different wordings of the same thing. Little like second year Daniel would just be like, okay, the reason the first one's wrong is this. The reason why the second one's wrong is this. The reason why the third one's wrong is this. A really effective thing to do when you're responding to an opposition speech is to recast the point that they're actually making in a more efficient way within your speech. So you can be like, they made 13 claims, but realistically, they just made one claim. Here's the one claim, I'm going to respond to them. It becomes a lot more difficult when they say, I've got 15 claims, and then this, like, point 1, sub-point 1, sub-point 4, sub-point 8, sub-point 9 are all the same thing. Then you have to like tease it out and try and break it up into groups. Be like, okay, overall they gave you a lot of subpoints, but the 3 layers that are important is they wanted to prove this, they want to prove this, they want to prove this. I'm going to address each of those things. So how you layer your responses isn't necessarily how you think about your responding, so it isn't thinking about the problems that are in people's speeches. It's rather figuring out, okay, what do I actually need to respond to in their speech? How do I gather it into a way that's effective? And so every time you're responding to someone's point, make sure you have like a, they said this, recharacterize their point, make it like achievable, efficient, so that you can then address it in an achievable, efficient way. In terms of stuff like even ifs, those are quite useful for pointing out how if one of your responses doesn't work, another response will work. And the classic even if is that something is unimportant, even if it is true. So you'll be like, it is not true for 8 reasons, but even if it was true, here's how it wouldn't have an impact within the debate. And what even ifs do essentially, most of the time, is they just prove how you are able to win even if the judge doesn't believe one particular claim. And often you'll have responsive points that either are like fatal, so if you prove just that one responsive point, they'll lose the debate, or it'll be cumulative. So it'll be like this plus this plus this plus this equals some weaker outcome. So say, for example, the impact is lower. And so tell judges what type of point that is. So for example, if you have like 3 things that if you prove any one of them is fatal to the case, make that very clear to the opposition. Judge, note, I have 3 responses to this. If any one of these 3 things is true, that point cannot stand because it is based on a bad assertion, the logic didn't operate on the point, and it's uncomparative. So walking through what those different types of points are in that. Even ifs are also quite an interesting example, not in quite the way I was talking about it there, where it's like showing how even if you lose one thing, you're still able to win the other points, in terms of like whether your responses are true. Often teams will use it to try and have their cake and eat it too, and develop 2 worlds in a much more substantive way than just the responsive point, and very, very good debaters, you'll see them do this all of the time. So that's something that I'm trying to work on a lot, trying to build in lots more even ifs to my speech, just because I like to present a very clear, reasonable vision of the world, and of course the judge will believe me because I'm very charming, but that's not how it works, right? I have to be much more open to the fact that often a judge will disagree with me, and so I need to do a little bit more work there in terms of painting different sides of the world while still maintaining that credibility. Okay, how do you rebut facts from the other team that you know are wrong? This is very difficult. A lot of the time, it is just about confidence. And there are some great examples. Talk to older debaters of your society where lies within the debate have won debates and it has been outrageous and infuriating, but sometimes that happens within debating. Like a very famous example is there was a debate about like sanctions on Iran, and one of the speakers from an unnamed campus from Wellington stood up and was like, the reason why sanctions on Iran won't work anymore is because China is building a pipeline to Iran to pump its oil out, and that's going to completely undermine all of the effects of the sanctions. And everyone was like, oh my god, I haven't heard of the pipeline to Iran. How did this not come up in our research? And so they ended up losing the debate. And then the third speaker from that team was just like, oh yeah, I made it up. Like, so sometimes that happens in debating. Don't do it. I think it's bad. You shouldn't do it. And it hurts your credibility a lot going forward, especially in a place like New Zealand. If you're known for making lies within debates, you kind of get found out, and then people are much less willing to trust you if they're very good judges and breakgrounds, which I think is good. So the way you deal with it is mainly just through confidence. The same way that they get them to believe a lie, because remember, it's just 2 competing assertions. The same way you do it is exactly the same way you rebut it. You just equally bombastically, equally clearly be like, judge, this is a lie, this is not true for X, Y, and Z reasons, and it actually doesn't matter whether you know it is wrong. This is something you should be doing with most of the points from the opposition. And so then when you've got these 2 assertions competing, this thing is true, this thing isn't true, the way the judge makes that decision is A, how people have walked it through, so saying like, this can't be true, this other thing can't be true because we know this, 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 and this. And if the judge thinks that this, 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 and this are correct, then they'll make the logical conclusion that the other thing that the team promised wasn't correct. So you can do it by like a technical way, figure out other things that are true the judge will think is true and then use it to disprove that thing. Or you can just be more persuasive and more believable. And remember how at the end of like the prepared section that I was discussing, I talked about using rebuttal points or responsive points to impact the overall case from the opposition to make them seem less believable. Those are the exact moments where those types of things become particularly useful. Judge, the opposition has clearly lied to you about this point, and in fact, we know that because now their second and third speaker didn't mention anything about it, despite it being so important to them in their first speech. How can you believe them making this new claim if they were so willing to lie previously? Don't do it that explicitly, but that's really the idea, that's really the overall angle of the way that you make those points in terms of undercutting the credibility of the other team and making people believe that the facts that you have brought are more likely to be true. Okay, how can someone become an adjudicator? Great question. We'll be having a whole section on adjudication, how to be a better adjudicator, and Auckland DevSoc is working on a really cool thing, a really cool new tool about adjudicating, which I'm very excited to show you all, which will be happening in a few weeks. As you can see, I've got way too much time during the lockdown. How can someone become an adjudicator? So first, it's just go to your club nights. Chat to your exec. I don't know what campus you're from. Flick me a message if you're from Auckland, or in fact from anywhere. Flick me a message, and then just offer to trainee certain debates. So by traineeing, what happens is you sit down with someone who's an experienced adjudicator, and essentially you don't actually judge the debate in that your decision doesn't impact who wins or loses the debate, but you do everything except that final stage of actually getting to decide. You tell them what you would have decided, you explain your reasoning, and then that judge will tell you things you can work on, how to get better at them, and will give their own adjudication, so you can then compare an experienced adjudicator's view of the debate and view of setting up things with how you have done it. And often when you've just started debating, you'll really have no clue how to do this, so it'll be very confusing, so don't worry about that. Your trainee, your adjudicator will take very good care of you. And then once you've done that a few times, what is traditional is for people to go to a tournament as a trainee. And essentially it's that same process I was talking about, but instead of being at a club night, you do it across the spread of a tournament. And you get very good judges who will assess how close you are to essentially being at the standard where they think you could be a good member of the New Zealand adjudication cohort. You make good contributions to the tournament. We believe you can get decisions right. They'll give you lots of feedback. It's a very intensive process to help get better at adjudicating. And so that will tend to be the process how people, and then at the end of that tournament, they'll either say, yes, we agree, or we think you need to have another try, you need to practice more, you need to work on these particular things. And lots of people take 2 or 3 tries, so it's quite a competitive process, but it makes you a way better adjudicator. I've heard it's a lot of fun, and it's something that you can work towards if you don't really keen to do speaking, but you are very keen to get involved with debating. So yeah, would encourage you to continue to do that. There's also a second way to accredit. What accrediting means to become an adjudicator, and that's if you do a lot of very competitive debating and you break at a number of tournaments. And then after that point, they allow you to become an adjudicator by virtue of having been at XYZ tournament. Cool. Any more questions? Some more tea. Okay, I think we can give it a couple more minutes. If you have any questions, please feel free to flick them as a comment or onto the forum. I will just drink my tea and feel very relaxed. Refreshing the Google form. You're all very quiet on the comment section today. Sorry, my girlfriend has a film camera, and she just texted me, "Hey Daniel." So I looked at her and she took a film photo. They're going to be called the lockdown files or something, the lockdown session or something. Very wanky and poetic. Well, yes, we are university students. Okay, one more minute. Oh, we've got another question. Should people sign up for club night tonight? Yes. That is amazing. Have a look at the forum. Oh, not that one. That one. Oh, geez, lots more people have signed up. That's very good. Yes, sign up. It'll be amazing. Hopefully some of you are watching our live stream, and so you can all do Benny together. New content. Just from Auckland Debating Society. Why am I only loved by Auckland Debating Society? I'm actually very, very sleepy. Lockdown is tough. Okay, we'll sign off at 5 past. Any last questions? Throw them in. What did we make for the past few meals? We made a very nice soup for lunch. That was great. And yesterday we made a soup for dinner. But there's different lunch soup and dinner soup. Our lunch soup was a curried lentil, and then our dinner soup was a potato and leek. And we also made congee with, which is like rice porridge common through many countries in Asia. And we put like chili oil in it and fried leeks. Very yum. Okay, I think that is all the questions. Beautiful. It was excellent seeing you all. Feel free to flick a message if you ever want to chat about rebuttal, responsiveness, the rest of the session. Most of the concentrated discussion is just in a 20-minute chunk at the beginning. Oh, an excellent question. Who's the best cook in the flat? My girlfriend has a culinary arts degree, so that is a very clear question. If the actual comparative that you want to be talking about is between me and Mr. Ascroft or Ms. Bellworthy, you'll need to ask another question. This is a man who's coming to Cinnamon Scroll, by the way, so you know that with a question like that, some of his coolness will rub off on you if you also sign up for Cinnamon Scroll. Sign-ups close on Sunday. Don't need a partner. Just need a willing attitude. Okay, I'm going to say goodbye now. It was lovely seeing you all. Kia ora, everyone. Minor delay. Sometimes we use Zoom to stream these events, and Zoom decided just not to work with Facebook Live, which obviously delayed our systems by a tiny bit. So I'm just going to spend 1 minute drinking my tea, taking in the beautiful atmosphere. Gonna give myself some tea. Hello to the nobody who's watching currently. Okay. Gonna give myself a big fuck of black. On the side. Kia ora to everyone who's watching. Still just waiting another couple of minutes for people to wander in. The lounge is just there. It's very close. It's not doing too well in the cold weather, so we've just oh, thank you, Grace. We've updated the plant for one that's a little bit more camera ready and give our chili plant a little bit of time to soak up some sun on the other side of the kitchen. Very, very relaxed. Just a couple of drips of water on my laptop, but that's all good. If it gets particularly cold, I have a very large white jumper that I will put on, so I will look like the character from Knives Out. Grace, in fact, before she moved into the flat, sent me a Christmas card. In that Christmas card was a recommendation to watch Knives Out, which is a very good recommendation because Tara and I watched it together. It was very lovely. Some kids are chasing pigeons. It's very sweet. Zach and be like, please pass on to Daniel to talk about this particular thing. It can be a little bit tough to speak for 1 hour about an arcane bit of debating theory when I don't have examples to bounce off against or questions. So really, really like the questions. Chuck those in and we can have a chat about them. Today, we're discussing weighing. And you'll hear lots of words that roughly mean similar things, not necessarily the same thing, but are all about trying to build up the importance of your point within a debate. So some people call it relevance, some people call it impacting or weighing. We're going to go through these, because I think they're actually slightly different concepts. We're going to go through the different ways in which points can be made important within a debate and make sure that we give you lots of practical examples about how to put it into your own debating. And note, this is not something you're going to spend a huge amount of time on in every debate. It tends to be something where simplicity and efficiency is a more effective way to do it than necessarily layering on the histrionics. But we're going to be giving you some of the solid foundations necessary to make your points feel more important within debates. I'm going to add 2 things before we jump into all of those ideas. The first is that, once again, there's Club Night tonight. Auckland Club Night is always popping. Live, we've had 1 or 2 clubs nights so far. I actually can't remember. But they've all been excellent, which is good. And this is also the last club night before Cinnamon Scroll. So if you are coming to Cinnamon Scroll, it's a really good opportunity to get acquainted with some of the other judges and speakers first up, but also to get acquainted with the technology, because obviously we're all facing a little bit of a transition here with how debating is going to operate when it moves into an online space. So if you are coming to Cinnamon Scroll, or in fact going to any online tournaments, would highly encourage you just to come along to Clubs Night to get a feel for how that stuff works. And in fact, I'm going to be doing a lot of the Zoom allocation and the Zoom work for Cinnamon Scroll itself. And to help me prepare for that, I'm going to be running all the allocations for Club Night tonight. So it will be very exciting to have lots of you along to give me a real taste of the horror that I have signed myself up for, but will be very fun. Question for my president. Is the development session going live? Development session is live to my understanding. Ava has just twigged that it is live. She did not get the notification, but good work following up. It's only like 3 minutes after the time that it should have gone. So that's like president onto it. And I hope she's tuned in now to hear me semi-roasting her on the live stream. Yeah, so if you're interested in Cinnamon Scroll, there's still a little bit of time if you wanted to trainee to get in touch with your exec from the particular campus you are. So if you're on the from Canterbury, get in touch with like Will Miller. If you're from Otago, get in touch with Joe Gary. If you're from Vic, get in touch with Brooke. If you're from Auckland, get in touch with Umber. Like lots of different people you can chat to. We still have a couple of spaces left for trainees, so looking to bring people in. So if you're interested in that, make sure you come along. Okay. So before we get into weighing and how weighing operates, I think what might be useful is giving a little bit of an overview over the stuff we've already discussed in these live stream series, and then explain how weighing fits into those ideas that we've been discussing. So obviously you'll all remember from the first video, one of the most important things that I think needs to happen in debating, particularly when you are doing your preps, is to think about two things. You need to think about the comparative. What are the two things we're comparing in this debate? What are the two worlds? What are the two positions? What exactly does either team stand for? If you don't understand what both teams stand for, it's very difficult to win a debate. You can easily get outflanked. Then secondly, the framework. How should the judge be thinking about the debate? How should the judge be judging the debate? And then from that framework, normally your points will flow very naturally. You'll be like, okay, I think this thing is really important, so my first point is how do we achieve this thing? Often your framework helps you generate the points. That's why I think it's really good for prep. In the second seminar, we talked about speaker roles. And through the speaker roles, we also did a lot of discussion of the comparative and the framework. But what weighing is important for every single speaker within a debate. Sometimes you hear people saying, oh, it's particularly important for leaders' replies or particularly important for third speeches. And though there is a slight shift in how much explicit weighing you do, because you've got more material on the table you can play with, you still need to be thinking as a first speaker and a second speaker about how do you make sure your points hold value within the debate, how do you push their relevance, how do you make sure that they're going to still stand at the end of the debate. And if you do that in a preemptive way, it's way easier for your second speaker and third speaker to be like, well, my first speaker did this, and I'm going to add this, this, and this. It just means that they have a lot more efficiency. They're able to do their job better. So you need to be thinking about weighing, impacting relevance of your points from the first moment of your prep all the way through each of the speeches, all the way to the leader's replies, and then hopefully in your feedback for your judge. Because if your judge has not discussed how they weighed points, they're probably engaged with the debate in a not particularly sophisticated way. In our third session, we discussed types of points, and we went through a whole different range. You have like your substantive and rebuttal points, often the ones people think of, and then you have your issue or clash points. I think issue and clash points is particularly where the weighing aspect comes in, because you're trying to weigh things. But obviously, if you're bringing a substantive point, you want to make sure that it has impact, it has weight. If you're bringing a rebuttal point, you want to make sure you're attacking impact and weight. And I think that brings very neatly onto last session, which was responsiveness, how to engage with the case that another person has brought to you. And we spoke about at the end of at the end of the different things you should be thinking about when you're responding. We talked about attacking the impact of the opposition's points, and we talked about attacking the weight of opposition's points. So making sure that you can minimize their points or explain why their points are unimportant is an effective skill when responding to other speakers. So how does this seminar fit then in the arc of what you're going to be learning? It particularly relates to what happens at the end of your points or at the end of your speech. So obviously a lot of you will be competent at making the points, walking through the mechanism, saying that, oh, this is the context, this is the logic, here's what I think happens, and then very unsure how to then make sure that it sticks within the debate or has impact. So what we're discussing particularly here is that last stage, how do you make sure that your points have relevance, stick within the debate, are powerful? If you tuned in on Saturday to the Noise from the Bench live stream, you will have noticed we did already have some discussion of these ideas. How do you make sure points are relevant? And we had it particularly through a discussion of principled points do principal points have relevance? And we came to a rough consensus that the way in which you should think about principal points is A, something that proves an outcome. Principal points can't just sit there in the abstract. They're never going to be helpful, or they can help you think about your framework. And often what I like to think of was when you're impacting and weighing points, you are engaging a little bit with that principled mindset. You're asking yourself, what is valuable? Why should I care about things? All of those framework questions you discuss at the very beginning of your prep. So in the live stream of Noise from the Bench, I think two things were very useful and said by my co-hosts. One was from Grace Belworthy, and she told you that it's important to keep it short. This is something that I think, when done efficiently and effectively, can really take your debating to the next level. But if you over-labor the point, it often loses its sting. It loses its ability to have an impact within the debate. So make sure you keep these things short. You very sharply explain why it's relevant, very sharply compare it to the other team's relevance, and moving forward. Joe said that there's a lot of discussion of words that may not be as popular in the South Island. So he pointed to example the way that I use impacting and weighing. And I apologized because I think I was using it a little bit imprecisely. When I talk about impacting and when I talk about weighing, I'm actually talking about slightly different things. And what Joe wanted to say was relevance is actually built into by those two things. So let's walk through how we get relevance and what is the difference between impacting and weighing. Your impacting is about explaining all of the different ways in which your point mechanistically has outcomes that are significant. So not about whether or not the debate, the point fits into your framework of the debate or how it overall affects the debate. What you're showing is that your point has potency, that it's something that prima facie is a big effect, is a strong effect, is something that should be cared about, that's not just a wash within the debate. Teams need to be careful about making this more when they go overseas than in New Zealand. Because overseas, judges have a much stronger tendency to discount material that is well made and well explained, but hasn't been impacted appropriately, hasn't been explained what the actual specific outcomes are or why those outcomes have particular potency. I have lost many debates to Australians because they take my well-crafted points and be like, but Daniel missed this key step because I was probably a little bit lazy or because I wasn't quite sure how to phrase it, and then they're able to run away with the debate. So I think this is quite a difficult skill. I think it still needs to be done efficiently, so don't over-labor it, but is something that is important, particularly if you're going overseas. So what are ways in which you can make sure that a point has impact? I break this down into roughly 5 or 6 different things I like to think about. And remember from the last session when we discussed the way I like to have like a whole bunch of things I'm thinking about, but in a debate I'll very rarely go through, and this is how to fix this, and this is how to fix this, this is how to fix this. When you're doing training, it's about building these skills intuitively into how you understand debating and how you're able to pull it out with ease. So when I'm thinking about impacting points, I think about these things. Firstly, I think about the certainty of the outcome. I think teams, especially when they're younger, they tend to think of points in rather a binary. Either I won this point or I didn't win this point. When in reality, that's not especially true. Often you're dealing with a risk of something occurring, and you need to explain how that risk is going to be something that's meaningful. And an example that I'll give is an Australs debate I did with Karan and Zach that was about basically the seizing of control of Kashmir by the Indian government, taking away some of the protections they previously had. One of the points that we argued in that debate is that there would be a risk of increasing the odds of more tension with Pakistan, which can increase the risk of war, which to the worst creates the risk of a nuclear war, and that's obviously an incredibly bad outcome. So what I think was very useful feedback we got from the judge is the judge was like, that could happen, but there's no effort in explaining to me how likely it was to happen, and so that makes it more difficult for me to credit it as a point within the debate. So if you're building, for example, a particularly large harm that has a low risk of happening, which often happens particularly in debates about like nuclear energy or in like nuclear weapons, but hey, also happens a lot in debates about like health and pandemics. Like this is a once in a many generations outcome. There was a very low chance of there being a pandemic, but the fact that we haven't prepared for it is obviously very devastating in a lot of areas. When you're thinking about making those very high impact points that have low certainty, build that into your analysis, explain, hey, it's got a low certainty. but if it does happen, it's catastrophic, and unlikely things happen all the time, therefore this should be built into your calculus. That's quite a sophisticated way of making a point, but if you don't explicitly engage with the certainty of the point, it becomes easy for otherwise well-made points to be discounted as too unlikely or too far outside of how normal policymakers would be making decisions, and therefore not given credit in the debate. So one, certainty. Second thing I like to ask is how widespread. How many people does it affect? How many institutions does it affect? How many people live within this particular ambit that we're caring about? I think this is a very underrated point, because often when you are comparing different impacts that are both bad, so you're going to be choosing between one bad thing or another bad thing, you need to be clear about how many people it affects, and you need to do this in a comparative way. Say, even if they prove this point, which often they'll be able to do, our point has more impact because it affects a larger range of people. The neat corollary of that, and the third thing I like to think about, is how severely does it impact those people? And obviously, there can often be a trade-off here. So you can have a point that affects a very wide range of people, but affects them in a relatively mild way, or you could have a point that affects very few specific people and affects them particularly strongly or particularly harshly. So sometimes there's a trade-off, and you need to explicitly engage in the comparative as to why you think it's worth making one trade-off or another, but it adds to the nuance, it adds to the flavor and richness of your point if you're able to articulate both how many people you think are likely to be affected and how severely you think it's likely to be affected. The third thing I think about, if you think about like the how severely as a how much does X thing impact the average person, also think about whether the group that is being hit, it has unique vulnerabilities that make an ordinary impact on individuals particularly more dangerous. And I like to think about this kind of in a fragile skull way, and this is a legal concept. Oh fuck, it's starting to rain. I'll think if it gets worse. So they'll be thinking in a thin skull way of thinking about things, where even if the force that is applied to the same people, like an equal breach of privacy, an equal violation, if we're another point, for some people who have, say, weaker defenses against that thing, it may have a particularly severe impact. So also think about the unique vulnerabilities of your target group, and that's the fourth thing I think about. The fifth thing I think is actually a very useful way to broaden your analysis and debate is to think about time. How does this affect things over a broad range of time? Is it very concentrated? How long-lasting are the effects? That adds value in terms of whether you think the point is going to have particular impact beyond just the narrow scope of, and I think it's particularly useful in BP. If your two teams talk in the very short term as opening, you can bring that long-term perspective. So think about how long something lasts. And then the final thing to think about is about then built into weighing, and that's how many people, that's how it fits into your broader framework. So I am just going to abandon my outdoor haunt and go inside. Ooh, it has started to rain. Okay, so you will get to watch me move in some furniture, which will be a very exciting week for you.
You right?
Nah, all good.
Sure need help?
Nah, all good. You can see how we set up the show in reality.
So another helpful window, it's a little bit, you don't need to put much, a little bit of work.
You'll recognize this side, this backdrop from Noise from the Bench.
And if you don't recognize it, you're in big trouble.
Probably gonna put that on the computer.
The forecast lied to me. Very sad. Thank you. Right. Cool. Yeah. While you're thinking, leave a comment. Okay, start one more. So, now we know that a transition inside can be made relatively painless. So we just moved the entire set inside. Very exciting. Okay, so if you have questions about impacting those 5 things that I talked about, make sure you leave a comment or make sure you leave a response in the online section, and we can get into those specifics of how they operate later. So no comments as of yet, so I'll go on to talking about weighing. When you think about weighing a point, always tie it back to the framework that you set up for how to judge the debate. And remember, you're going to be wanting to do this from the very earliest stages of your prep time. You're going to be wanting to think, what is important within this debate? How do I make the judge care about it? Sometimes this will be discussed as like a principled framework or a principled point, and I'd encourage you not to adopt that specific framing. Always be very clear about exactly what the impact of the point is going to be, how it changes the way the judge should judge the debate, and avoid language that suggests that your point is only abstract or is only principled. Because some judges, particularly unsophisticated judges, won't be able to tell the difference, and they'll want to discriminate against that point because they'll just be like, oh, it's another dumb principle point. So you don't want to leave them any room to do that. You want to be very clear about what you're doing with the point, and that is how the framework operates. So weighing is just saying, okay, if you think that these 2 things are proved within this debate, here's how you should compare them relative to that overall framework that has been set up. So it's often a very simple thing to do, but is missed by teams because either they haven't put the work in establishing what they need to do to win in terms of establishing how principally the debate should be judged. And if they miss doing that, it makes their points overall kind of adrift and at risk of being outflanked by a sophisticated other team who's able to argue in a much more framework-based way how the judge should judge the debate. So that's what we mean by weighing. And I'll go through an example now just to make it very clear about how these things operate. But before that, I'll jump into some of the responses that we got. And the first is, what do you mean by framework? So that was exactly what I was discussing before. A framework is something that explains to the judge how they think how you think they should be judging. And often that's by like picking a particular group that you just think is more impacted by, a particular point that you think has the most impact. That's the most ordinary framework, just like how much good or how much harm does something do? At its basis, like most debates are about that, and most of us adopt a very standard, do I think this causes more harm to more vulnerable people who we care about more type of framework. But you can add more sophisticated layers in explaining how particular points operate. And the way I like to think about it is sometimes points are like a chain that leads you to an outcome you want within the debate, victory within that debate. So you have to prove each of those points. Those points build one on the other to get that outcome. Or sometimes you'll take a wider approach where instead of having one chain where if one of those links fails, you're not able to win the debate, you have multiple avenues towards winning the debate. That's how you contrast those 2 different approaches within a case. So I would, in your framework, be quite explicit about that to the judge. Be honest and be like, we win this debate if we're able to prove either this or either this, and then explain how you've got 2 paths to victory there, or explain, I think we win this debate if we're able to prove this overall thing. We achieve that by proving this thing, and this thing. So you need to have those win conditions in mind. You need to have that framework in mind for the judge in order then to make points that can have the most weight and relevance and importance within the debate. So the second question we got is, what is a principled point? What are other types of points? Note here there's a lot of crossover between the way that these points operate because the labels that people use don't match exactly what they want to come out of that point. At its worst, a principled point is a point that doesn't have any impact. Normally it's just an appeal to people's biases. It's an appeal to how they think the world should operate. So even if we aren't able to explain to you why it's good or bad, you should still go along with it. That is very ineffective in debating and is often a waste of time. So to never be like, it's the principle of the thing that matters. Be like, you have to explain how it has outcomes. As we discussed in Noise the Bench, I think there's 2 useful ways to think about like useful principle points. One's that framework you're talking about. How do you have, what should we value within the debate? Why should we care about one outcome over another outcome? You need to do the work behind that, and that's often what's discussed as weighing. And then the other type is basically like a very sophisticated practical point. that attempts to make slightly diffuse harms, but make those diffuse harms actually real. So you still are linking it to an outcome. You're just discussing it with the language of principle, which can sometimes be ineffective because it creates that confusion. So be very clear about the outcomes you're producing. That should probably be contrasted with your typical like outcome-based point, like what people at schools tend to refer to as a practical point. All of your points should have realistic outcomes to be, so this should be basically all of your points. And then, of course, you have like context points, which are really about like painting a world, and you have like impact points, which are about explaining why one particular thing has such a particular effect. But when we start breaking it down to that level, often you'll be doing those things within one broad like practical point. You'll have your context, you'll have your mechanisms, and you'll have your impact. So make sure that you have all those things within a point. And if you just decide to split it in three, you're necessarily going to be adopting a relatively narrow set of pathways that you can use to win the debate. Okay, so we'll dive into a quick walkthrough of an example and how to think about weighing that example within a debate. So let's take the example of the legalization of drugs, as we discussed in the last session. So if you are saying, I want to legalize drugs because I think the war on drugs is particularly bad and has horrible consequences. So you've made that point well, you've explained how police violence operates, you've explained how it leads to incursions from the surveillance state, you've explained how it's often poor people, well, actually no, you haven't done the but you've explained the mechanism of how the war on drugs works, and say you're also able to clearly show mechanisms behind why the same thing doesn't happen when you abolish it. Like, so you've been able to explain why it only exists in a world where you get rid of those drugs. Because remember, you have to be thinking about that comparative. Let's go through all the different things that are important to giving a point impact and weight within a debate and how they would apply. So first thing's certainty. You will have made a set of claims within assessing your point. And at that stage, you need to be really realistic about how certain it is. And I think the way you do it in this debate is to be like, it won't happen in every case. Some cases are unique where the gangs are particularly entrenched and would lead to certain bad outcomes. But what we know is over a broad range of the rest of the things, it's very likely to have this impact. We've seen it in this example, I've seen an example, I've seen it in this example. Basically what that's saying is quantifying for the judge how likely you think something's going to happen, and making it clear that you believe your point is very certain, just in case the opposition tries to paint your point as being like a moonshot, very unlikely, like the point that we brought in that Australs debate about nuclear war with Pakistan potentially breaking out. So you need to be honest about the certainty of that point. The second thing you say is how many people will this impact? So you'd be like, the war on drugs impacts a huge range of people across these long supply chains. And so if we were to decrease the war on drugs, you're necessarily going to have flow-on effects, not just to the people who are engaged in the coca trade themselves, but also their families. Also making sure that there's ways to make that point widespread and add nuance there into making the debate affect more. And note, you need to do it in a comparative way. So if they're able to prove that, yes, some people would still have drug overdoses, because say like they've been able to win that point, you say, well, we think that this affects more people because a smaller percentage of people take the drugs and a much larger group of people are involved in this production, not necessarily by their own choice. Then if we think about how severely something is going to happen, we're going to think, well, for some people who are like smoking marijuana, the impact is like maybe some people will have a bad impact because they'll increase their consumption of marijuana, but the real severe harm is the people who get arrested. The real severe harm is people who die in like gunfights on the Colombian border. That's a particularly severe harm. That's something we should compare about a lot. Then we think about unique vulnerability. You can explain people who consume drugs often in the West have access to a lot more healthcare, a lot more services. They tend to be better taken care of. And even if they are drug addicts for a certain period of their life, they often have support to get their lives back on track. Compare this to the people who are sacrificed in the war against drugs. They tend to be people from places who are way more vulnerable. They tend to have way less choice and be way more like exposed to violence. And the communities that tend to be targeted by the war on drugs with things like possession, we only lock up the people who are most vulnerable already, not the people who are rich, because we know that white and rich people tend to get away with drug consumption way more than people who are poor and people who are minorities. So thinking about that unique vulnerability. And then finally, how long does it last? once again, comparative, you'll be like, when you put someone in prison, you don't just impact them, you also think about their kids, people who come after them, the communities that decrease their resilience. That's something that is bad. That's something that hurts these communities intergenerationally. That's something we should compare about a lot. Note, I spent probably a little bit too much time fleshing out each of these things. You're going to want to build them into quite a continuous line to give them a lot of impact within the debate. So if I were to do that quite quickly, I'd be like, we need to legalize we need to legalize drugs to end the war of drugs, because we know that the war of drugs is hurting many people and that decreasing it will take away the power of the state to oppress these people. We know it affects a lot of people down supply chains that cross different borders. We know that those people are impacted incredibly severely because they die, they're put in prison, they have their lives taken away from them. And these are groups that are particularly vulnerable because they tend to be poorer, they tend to have less access to resources relative to the other people who would be dealing with. And we know that it impacts them intergenerationally. They're never able to escape the way that their communities are unable to escape the way that this has impact on them. So if you see there, you'll have this written down at the end of your point, just how do you tie it all together and make me care specifically about that group of people who are being impacted, care about the outcome of that point. And note, you're going to want to specifically do this in a comparative way. You're going to want to be explaining how the points that have been proved by the opposition could not stack up with the impact we have within this debate. Then, once you've done the impacting stage of explaining why your point is relevant, you jump down to the weighing aspect. And this is explaining the framework. This is explaining how the point has weight within the framework that you've set up for the debate. So the question there is saying, why should I care about this particular outcome relevant to how you've set up the debate? And if it's a debate about the legalization of drugs, you may think two things. Firstly, is the very normal harm calculus. We should care about this thing because it's a way more all of the other stuff that I talked about, and the goodness that comes out of it is outweighs the badness that they've been able to prove. So that's the very simple trade-off, making it very explicit to the judge that your point is more important than the opposition's. A more sophisticated lens that can be taken is that we should care particularly about people who haven't made the decision to get themselves in the problems that they're dealing with. So you could weight particularly the risk that some people in the rich world will die of overdoses, and them choosing to engage in starting to take the drugs, the fact that rich college kids might be impacted harmfully. We care less about that, not because the impact is lesser on them, but because they don't fit within our framework of what we should care about within the debate. So that's how you can add another framework lens and then explain how within the debate, even if they've proved that an impact is particularly severe, why we shouldn't care about it as much within the broader framework that we've established. And then, of course, the last thing to do is to explain the impact, the relevance of that broader point to coming to your end decision. So explaining the war on drugs is such an important point within this debate that even if we lose all of the rest of the points within this debate, we still think we're able to win, because giving a realistic, and I think obviously the war of drugs is an enormous impact, a very tough thing to think about. So you're going to be wanting to have that very specific lens, very specific explanation as to why your point has that impact on the overall debate. Cool. Any more questions? Sorry for the abrupt set change. Joe and Grace are cooking something that smells amazing.
It's feta and spinach quiche.
Grace just said it's a feta and spinach quiche. Was very wet. I'll just have a chill for 5-10 minutes. So if you have questions, flick a question either on the Facebook video or to the anonymous forum that's in the little live stream description.
We're not going to use this on the
Mm-hmm. I hope you're excited for Cinnamon Scroll. I think it'll be very fun. Also, international viewers, we have a surprising amount of people from overseas who watch. If I ever discuss something that's too New Zealand specific, just flick a little comment through and I'll explain the relevance of that, because obviously I come from a particular cultural perspective that makes things that seem very obvious and normal to me not obvious and normal to other people. People too from particularly different debating circuits. And come to Cops Night. It'll be very fun.
On Twitter, I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, that's right. That was like to one of my group chat, Jamie and and stuff came for a video session virtual pub trip at some point tonight. I said that sounds good. I think Mitch and Ken will be handed tonight because for a couple of different reasons. The Thursday before Easter, the last couple of years.
Ooh, question. As a third speaker, should I spend more time weighing or rebutting material? I always struggle to get that balance right. I think that's a very good question, and you need to ask yourself a set of strategic questions. So the first strategic question is, how likely am I to beat this point? And to beat a point means you explain why the logic is faulty, or to explain why the outcome doesn't, the outcome doesn't flow as they expected to, or the context is different such in a way that the whole point dematerializes. And that means that the outcome won't happen within the debate and therefore cannot be weighed. So if you think that's possible, and as a third speaker, you normally will have gotten to a stage within the debate where it's quite clear how much you think they'll be able to prove in that, do that, add that extra rebuttal. That's very important and very compelling. The second thing that you need to ask is, can I rebut this in a way that decreases the overall impact? So say you're not trying to knock out a point completely, but you can still minimize that point. You can add bits of justification, or you can add bits of explanation that decrease the overall impact of that point. That's something that you should be thinking about, and that'll often be considered a rebuttal section. So if you deal with all of the rebuttal stuff in terms of, I think the point doesn't work, if you deal with all the rebuttal stuff in terms of, I don't think the impact is what they claim it is, it's not as widespread, it's not as severe, it's not as XXXXX, then thirdly, the third thing you think about is, how do I minimize the importance of this within a debate? So generally I would do all three when I'm speaking third, and you build it into your introduction, you build it in throughout your speech, adding that slant towards particular outcomes being important within the framework that you've built for the adjudicator. And so it's necessarily a balance of where you think that time is more effectively spent. And often, I would just encourage you, if you cannot beat a point and you're just wasting time saying things that you don't that just like are implausible, you don't think the judge will buy it, spend more time minimizing the impact of it within the debate rather than throwing away time trying to rebut like really obvious prescriptions that are otherwise true. And if you build into your mind that I need to deal with the impact, then I need to deal with the weight, it becomes quite easy to think about the three things you need to do: rebutting the impact, explaining why it doesn't have weight within the debate, and integrate those in ways that are clear to the judge. So obviously there's going to be a little bit of a balance there, and you just have, it's one of those things that you just have to do more debating, figure out more, am I doing too much of one thing, too little of another thing, but it will be quite debate specific. I think you do need to be rebutting the impact and rebutting the weighting within a debate. So don't have all of your time spent on rebutting. That's often a note of someone who doesn't have a lot of experience within debating, haven't built in those even if arguments, those explanations of, okay, even if they are able to prove that logic, why don't you still allow them to win the debate? And it'll just add a huge amount to how your points come across and how they play out in the end consequences of the debate. Cool. How do you weigh points in a leader's reply? I love leader's replies. I think they are excellent. The first thing that I think about is, once again, what is my framework for winning the debate? What plus what equals me winning? Have I run points that are dependent on one another or dependent on some bit of context that's all about winning that particular bit of context? or are they multiple pathways to victory that I just need to plug in what's most appropriate? So in terms of the specifics of how you weigh things in a leader's reply, I don't think it's particularly different in the actual process of weighing. You still want to explain it relative to that framework. You still want to be going through why the impacts that you are building are more important than the impacts in another debate, but it'll just be your entire speech. So you need to be like, so the way I set up my points when I'm doing a leader's reply is I'll say, I'll have my points of clash. My points of clash will normally lead to the outcome within the debate. If they win these 3 points of clash, they win the debate. If we win XYZ points of clash, we are able to win this debate. Even if we lose this point of clash, we're still able to win this debate. So have that strategic mindset. And then you go specifically with the comparative and you say, this is what they wanted to prove within this debate. This is what they did prove within this debate. So filling in the rebuttal and filling in the impact. This is how it fits within the framework. Do we think it's important or not? And then compare. This is what we wanted to prove within this debate. This is what we did prove within this debate. Goes into certainty, severity, all those things we talked about. And then comparing those two things, the reason why our material has more justification within the debate, more relevance within the debate is, and then you'll just point to the key bits that you're able to make. Because sometimes they'll make a point that seems really clever and it's really well explained, but because they've missed something about the framework or something about the comparative, it doesn't have much weight within the debate. And so you'll be able to point that out there. So in leader's reply, always comparative, going through in a very thorough, methodical way gives a lot of strength and structure to your case. My flatmates are making banana bread. It's so exciting. So it's really unnerving. Facebook Live has made me updates to their new version of doing it, and it keeps flashing as though like the screen is turning off. And I'm like, oh my god, did the water get into my laptop? But no, I just think it's their new way of imposing. They've nudged me into making this. They slowly made it impossible for me to use the old version. Apologies for the brief rain delay. The rain has stopped now, but the floor is wet, and the sky is very grey, as you can see. And after that brief weather interlude, I think at this point I'm going to say goodbye to you and start preparing for the next glorious club night that Auckland EPSOC is hosting. So yes, remember, if you're keen, still time to sign up for club night, still time to trainee at Cinnamon Scroll if you are interested. We would love to have you at both of these events, and I hope you have a beautiful weekend regardless of whether you're debating or not.